Good evening, I'm Heyling Chan in Hong Kong, and welcome to ViewTV News. Coming up on tonight's show. Hong Kong activists take refuge in Germany, and Pandems say it's a warning sign. Meanwhile, Justice Secretary Teresa Cheng has refused to comment on the matter. Extradition law amendments are in full focus as lawmakers grill the chief executive during her monthly Q&A session. Peaceful protests turn deadly in Jakarta as Indonesia plunges into post-election violence. Pan-Democrats are warning that Germany's reported decision to grant asylum to 2 Hong Kong activists is a bad sign and that the city's rule of law may be in danger. This comes after Ray Wong and Alan Lee told the New York Times that Berlin gave them refugee status in May last year, as they face riot charges over the 2016 Mongkok clashes. LegCo member Eddie Chu said today he believes Germany doesn't think Hong Kong's justice system is fair and that the government here has been suppressing anti-government protesters. And Civic Party member Kwok Ka-ki said this was an alarming development. And the fact that the pair received asylum shows that Germany doesn't have faith in the city's judicial system. Meanwhile, Justice Secretary Teresa Cheng refused to comment on the matter, but Security Secretary John Lee insisted that the pair jumped bail and should be treated differently from other refugees.
There are 46 laws relating to the transfer of fugitives, and they are each very specific. None of them covers a person who jumps bail. Law enforcement will consult legal advice and take appropriate action pertaining to these fugitive laws if it is appropriate.
Well, no prizes for guessing what topic was at the top of the agenda during question time with Carrie Lam. The chief executive faced a barrage of questions related to the proposed changes to the city's extradition law. At the same time, the amendments have drawn ire from former Governor Chris Patten. Ryan Chang has the details.
Arriving to LegCo to protests from Pan-Democrats and leaving the same way just 30 minutes later. Chief Executive Carrie Lam was grilled by lawmakers during that time with nearly all the questions about controversial changes to Hong Kong's extradition laws.
I ask you not to raise false alarms about foreign interference for the sake of attacking your political enemies. You are covering up the disgraceful intrusion of the liaison office.
Some members have a double standard. If the central government says a few words on the matter, that equals interference. But when some lawmakers travel overseas and ask for foreign countries to intrude, that's not a problem. So I have to ask all members to be consistent with their words and actions.
Some legal scholars in the city say according to the basic law, the chief executive answers to the central government. If Beijing requests transferring a suspect, the chief executive has no right to object.
The process is very secure and reliable. There won't be a situation where a chief executive will act independently.
Accountancy sector lawmaker Kenneth Leung also blasted the government, criticizing it for elbowing the amendments through LegCo before it breaks for the summer. Lam said there are time constraints to have the law changes passed before a Hong Kong man suspected of murder in Taiwan is freed from jail in October. Meanwhile, pro-Beijing heavyweight Junius Ho asked Lam when Article 23 would be enacted in Hong Kong. But Lam admitted that now is not the right time to push the national security laws through.
Since taking up office, I have hoped to create favorable conditions to implement Article 23. But unfortunately, we are getting further from achieving our goal. I have to accept this political reality.
The law changes would allow one-off extraditions to be carried out between the city and places it doesn't have formal treaties with, including Taiwan and the mainland. ICAC Chief Simon Pei threw support behind the amendments, saying it may help the watchdog's work in stamping out corruption. He admitted that a number of suspected criminals are currently hiding in the city after committing graft elsewhere. But political veterans overseas expressed worries over the amendments. In an interview in London, Hong Kong's last governor Chris Patten said the government's proposed laws are, quote, the worst thing to happen to Hong Kong since the 1997 handover. Ryan Chang, ViewTV News.
Well, 9 letters have been submitted by lawmakers to LegCo's House Committee about the extradition law amendment. DAB's Holden Chow proposed cancelling the Bills Committee, hoping to fast-track the law changes. Meanwhile, Regina Ip is supporting the government's decision to resume the bill's second reading next month. Pro-establishment lawmakers suggested alternatives to the question and answer session with officials in an attempt to push ahead with the law amendment. But pro-democracy lawmakers also wrote in to urge the committee to oppose the bill's fast track to the full council. LegCo's Public Works Subcommittee continued to discuss a $550 million grant application for research on Lantau Tomorrow Vision. The controversial $624 billion project aims to build 1,700 hectares of artificial islands in waters off Lantau Island. Lawmakers question the government about content overlap from a previous study on Kennedy Town and East Lantau Metropolis. Meanwhile, other members question the government's knowledge of land shortage data.
The 2015 report had already substantially pointed direction for railway and highway research. Is there an overlap in your current ongoing research? Why would you repeat this again?
Since the Land Supply Task Force started, it has continuously told the public that Hong Kong's land supply shortage is more than the 1,200 hectares mentioned in the 2030-plus paper. You couldn't figure out how much land to add, so we got forced into choosing this reclamation option.
Our planning is not a simple math problem. Our planning caters to uncertainties in the future, so you can't just say in the future we lack this much, so let's do this much.
Over in Indonesia, at least 6 people have died as violence flares up after the country's election results were announced. The opposition against incumbent leader Joko Widodo's re-election called for large-scale protests, alleging that there was election fraud. Michelle Hennessy reports.
Protests that started peacefully in Indonesia turned deadly overnight. Joko Widodo's re-election as president sparked civil unrest in the capital, Jakarta. The country had been awaiting official results since the April 17 election. Soon after, supporters of Widodo's challenger took to the streets. Police used tear gas and water cannon to disperse crowds Tuesday night as protesters hurled fireworks and set private property ablaze. This was the scene on Wednesday. Riot police are bracing for further mass protests. Authorities have said 40,000 police and army personnel were on duty across Jakarta. Opposition candidate Prabowo Subianto has refused to concede defeat. He said on Tuesday he believes there'd been widespread cheating in the polls and was making legal efforts to, quote, defend the mandate of the people. An election supervisory agency said there was a lack of evidence to support claims of systematic cheating, and independent observers have said the poll was free and fair. The result released by the General Election Commission gave Widodo more than 55% of the votes. Some schools and offices in the capital have shut this week as police say they've detained dozens of militant Islamists suspected of planning attacks.
Coming up next, the latest from the world of business. Let's start with a look at the markets today. Here in Hong Kong, the Hang Seng Index was flat, finishing the day 0.2% higher at 27,706. Gains were capped over a report that the U.S. could blacklist another Chinese tech firm after banning Huawei last week. Over on the mainland, the Shanghai Composite Index ended mostly flat today as well, closing 0.5% down at 2,892. Despite concerns about mainland tech companies, shares in the industry gained 1.1% today, while stocks of basic materials slid 1.2%. Well, as we mentioned, investor sentiment is largely being driven by worries over the Huawei fallout in the U.S. Beijing says it opposes Washington's smearing Chinese companies after reports it was weighing up similar sanctions on another tech firm. Our correspondent Samantha Vardas has the details from the capital.
Well, according to the New York Times, the US is considering Huawei-like sanctions on Chinese video surveillance firm Hikvision. The paper said this would effectively limit the company's ability to buy US technology, and American firms may have to obtain government approval to supply components to it. Now, Hikvision calls itself the world's largest video surveillance gear maker, and its products are used extensively throughout the mainland. The company has been specifically cited in a letter to Trump's advisors calling for tighter US export controls over the treatment of Muslims in Xinjiang. Now, things escalated between the US and China last week when Washington stuck Huawei on a trade blacklist before temporarily loosening up restrictions to minimize disruption. The move effectively bans US firms from doing business with Huawei, which has remained defiant, saying it can ensure a steady supply chain without US help. Now, according to Reuters, Hikvision echoed a similar sentiment today, saying even if the US stops selling to them, they can remedy it through other suppliers, though it told Reuters it has not yet been informed of any possible US blacklisting.
Although most US farmers will complain about China's retaliatory tariffs on their products, garlic farmers in California say more duties are a ray of sunshine for them. Yahira Yaquez takes a look at some unlikely winners of the US-China trade war.
U.S. farmers have been among the hardest hit in the U.S.-China trade war. But not California garlic farmers, who for decades complained about the flood of cheaper garlic coming in from China. They say they've benefited from the tariffs since they make it more expensive to buy Chinese garlic. Ken Christopher is one of those farmers. He's vice president of Christopher Ranch, the largest commercial garlic producer in the U.S.
We understand that for many U.S. farmers, particularly those in the middle of the country, those farmers that rely on a single commodity and they rely on exports to a state-run authority like China, that this trade war may not be in the best interest. But in any trade war, there are going to be winners and losers.
And a recent escalation in trade tensions between the world's two largest economies has kept him winning. Tariffs on Chinese garlic increased from 10 to 25% on May 9th, when President Donald Trump ramped up tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods, dashing hopes of striking a deal. For garlic farmers, President Trump's latest escalation couldn't have come at a better time. With the start of the harvest season just weeks away, Christopher says they're expecting a surge in demand.
Celebrity chef Jamie Oliver's UK restaurant chain has filed for bankruptcy because of increased competition and escalating rent. All but 3 of the group's 25 restaurants will close, leaving about 1,000 people jobless. Oliver said on Twitter that he was devastated by this and thanked staff and suppliers for putting their hearts and souls into the business for over a decade. The 43-year-old himself injected millions of dollars from his own savings to salvage his business when it ran into financial trouble 3 years ago. But that didn't work, and the group struggled to find interested buyers for it last year. Overseas operations of his restaurants aren't affected, including 2 Jamie's Italian branches in Hong Kong. Time for a break now, but do stay with us. Coming up next, a Taiwanese artist creates giant inflatables of a tank and Tank Man, the lone protester who stood in front of a convoy of tanks on Beijing's Tiananmen Square. That's to mark 30 years since China's bloody crackdown on the pro-democracy movement.
Veer away from the illusion of